Okay, thank you so much for inviting me. It's nice to see some familiar faces. So for those of you who don't know, I work with the Wiltshire Wildlife Trust in the Biological Record Centre, so the Wiltshire and Swindon Biological Record Centre. I'm also a Wiltshire Climate Alliance member. So I'm just going to go through a little bit of an introduction / refresher for those of you who've seen similar presentations by the AWI community before, and then go into a couple of updates on the project and also kind of how this ties into Wiltshire Climate Alliance, which would be really interesting. So the AWI was first introduced in the 1980s, basically just before computer mapping really became available and sort of wide web, if you will. And so the whole point of the AWI is to do evidence-based conservation management. So it's to take historic records and also field surveying and take those two components to make sort of like a giant World Wide Web. I say World Wide Web, sort of more like a national web, where we can see the ancient woodlands across the UK, predominantly in England, as this is a national project. So I took this photo the other week down at Middleton Down. It's at one of our reserves. I do highly recommend visiting on a nice day like today. It's very beautiful there. But the reason I took this photo is because it highlights one of the habitats that we're kind of trying to focus on at the moment, which didn't get done the first time round, which are wood pasture and parkland. Now, this does touch on a little bit more on that in the handbook, which I do have a link to later on. But the reason I wanted to show you it is it kind of has all the components that I'm really focused on. So in the left there, you can see like a tree that's fallen, naturally felled, got a bit of dead wood going on. The branches behind it, sort of like the woodland bit, a little bit of tiny woodland there. If you look straight ahead, you can see the cattle. So that's how it's being managed. It's being grazed. Those aren't dogs around the cows. Those are calves. My camera isn't very good. Apologies for that. And then if you look slightly off center, you can see kind of what looks to be like a border of trees. Now, we're not really interested in borders, even if they have ancient features, unfortunately, because they're not continuously ancient woodland, if that makes any sense. So that's what we're really, really interested in, is continuous ancient woodlands in 16 AD. So some of you who might have seen the Wiltshire Ancient Woodland Inventory before would have seen Ewan, whose hand is just in the bottom left-hand corner there. 5 points to anyone who can guess what plant that is. It's one of my favorites, so I hope you will know which one it is. So there are 4 main components to the project, but I've mentioned 5 here, and I'll get on to why in a little bit. But the first one was capturing the data set. So I wasn't here for that. That was Ewan. That was mainly outlining Wiltshire in terms of what woodland we definitely knew was there, and then eliminating anything from the 20th to late 19th century. And so then for phase 2, we compared that with the AWI from the 1980s, because between now and the 1980s, in that time frame, at some point, those maps did get put online. They were digitized, so we could see the work that they'd done online to sort of map it against what we know about England today, which is really, really interesting. And then we've also removed any current woodlands that have, popped up in the 21st century, because they're not going to be ancient, unfortunately. They have great ecological value, really, really important for other parts of wildlife, but they're not important to my project, unfortunately, which is really sad. So now we're at the phase 3, which is gathering additional evidence. So this is predominantly through historical records. So we've been visiting the Wiltshire and Swindon History Centre. They have been absolutely amazing with us. We get to see all these old maps, so like tithe maps and things like that, ancient documents. Some of it is in Latin, so very difficult to read. We do have someone on hand who can translate Latin, believe it or not, which is incredible. I have no idea how she does it. Within like a couple of days, she pinged back the document. She's like, I translated all of this and it's nothing to do with woodlands. I was like, oh, really? I took a photo of it, all for it to not be relevant at all. But we're also in peak sunny days like today and a lot of rainy days going out and surveying. So we're mainly interested in archaeological features and the baseline botany. So a question I often get asked is, what's the oldest tree you found? And I found many, many old trees, but that's unfortunately not what we're interested in. We're interested in ancient habitats, so ancientness in a sense. So these can be like old banks, which I believe was in the last photo a little bit, yeah. So this kind of, I don't know if you can see my mouse, I really hope you can. But they're kind of these natural banks here, and then usually they're dug out quite a bit here, which this bank in this case doesn't seem to have. So I do think it might be man-made, but that's kind of what we're searching for in terms of archaeological features. I'll get into phase 4 later on. So that's mainly evaluating everything that we've compiled towards the end. And then phase 5 is about continuing this project after the deadline. So hopefully we'll be able to package it up in a little bow, send off a report to Natural England. But then what happens then? We don't want to wait another 40 years. We don't want it to go stagnant for another 40 years. Technology is rapidly improving every day. So that's kind of our hope at the Record Centre, is to continue all that work and dedication to our ancient woodlands in Wiltshire. I can't promise that across the board in England. I know that predominantly AWI officers are in the Biological Record Centre, but I can't speak for them at this time. So this is the update. So those of you who might have seen a previous AWI talk would have been with Ewan. I'm not Ewan. I should have led with that. I am Charlotte, unfortunately. But we also now have a project officer, Michael. He's not with me today. He was at the historical centre today, actually taking pictures of different maps for me. But I thought that this would be a really nice example to show you the kind of work that we do. So on the left here, this is an Epoch 1 map. So the original county series from the Ordnance Survey. So that would have been from about 1854 to 1901. It's of hazelland wood, which is about a fifth of that size now. So that hasn't been long at all, really, in terms of time. That's a very, very short period of time for that woodland to go. But the reason I like this picture so much is because you can see the buildings. The buildings are really nicely highlighted in a lot of these Epoch 1 maps. And we have the water flowing through, we have a farm, we have roads. It shows everything. You can see the hedgerow boundary as well, which again isn't important to the project, but it just shows you the differences when it comes to woodland. Please don't jump up here. I'm sorry, I have a cat. I'm really concerned that she's going to jump up here and come and step on the keyboard. And then towards the bottom here, I have a couple of floral examples. So the middle one is the early purple orchid. Very, very obvious by these nice dark purple spots. They are purple. My phone just, again, really bad camera quality, makes it just look black, but they are like a beautiful purple color. And then to the left, we have Geomander speedwell, very, very important for Lepidoptera species. And then to the right, we have Dog's Mercury. So for anyone who didn't know, dogs just means fake. So it's not real mercury, which I'm glad, because I'm pretty sure that's not meant to be a plant. So I don't know. I thought it was really cool. So this is kind of some of the work that Ewan was doing in phase 1 and 2. So this was the existing AWI from the 1800s, Jesus, from the 1980s. So as you can see, quite sparse looking, very patchy, quite fragmented woodlands. Compared to what he found an additional 6,000 parcels. 6,000 parcels. That's a lot of woodland. Now, not all of that is ancient, but not all of it's recent. So this is what I was talking about a little bit earlier, about those extra habitats that didn't get included the first time around. They only really had time to compare woodland to woodland. They didn't include parklands, other types of habitats. So now that we can see the kind of green space we're working with, we can start to eliminate the ones that are or are not of interest. I went too fast, did I? No, it's fine. So this is phase 4 is what we're going to be moving on to next. So hopefully in a couple of months. And what we'll be doing is integrating the evidence we've got from phase 3. assessing whether those woodlands were continuous or not. So do they have the ancient features? It's quite a large list of different criteria on what would or wouldn't meet an ancient woodland for this project. But continuity is the most important one, it's the most valuable one to us. Recording those wood, pasture and parkland habitats and then submitting the report. So this was, I'm going to move this bar at the top for me so I can actually read some of this. There we go. So this is what I wanted to talk about with everyone today, was about how this all ties back into the bigger picture. I've included quite a few different quotes there from worthy sources, I'd say, in my opinion. So what I firstly wanted to say was a lot of people believe that there's about 10% woodland cover over the UK. It's actually 12%. There's extra 2%. It does add up. But in England, it is only 10%. And then in Wiltshire, we have 8% across the county, judged on the data that we have overall, I believe. But 3% of it is ancient. And that 3%, I'm not sure whether that was just from the previous AWI or from other projects as well. But hopefully this project will be able to increase that percentage. I hope it doesn't decrease it. I hope it increases it. But I also wanted to talk about how we all know that they're vital carbon storage sources for our planet, and they're all really, really good for the ecology. They have these really, really rare species that you can't find elsewhere, some of which we've already touched on. But what I was interested in was a recent study by Professor Disney, who took everything in me not to put like some Mickey Mouses on top of that. But he probably gets that all the time. I don't think I should do that. But what he was using was 3D scanning and lasers to be able to kind of size up a tree. So a lot of the time, in order to understand, okay, I'm so sorry. It thought I wasn't using my other computer, so it's just shut it down. Yeah, I don't know either. Sorry, where was I? So they've been using kind of like scanning and lasers to be able to size up different trees. So a lot of the time previously, in order to kind of understand the carbon storage and what was going on in habitats, some of the trees would have to get cut down, which isn't very good if we're going to use them as carbon sinks. So they were doing all these different scans, and they were able to find that hopefully we should have double the amount of storage that we thought originally, which is incredible. But then he also makes this really, really valuable point that we are constantly hearing in the media at the moment: we need to plant more trees, we need to plant more woodlands, we need to expand our woodlands. And I'm not disagreeing with that. I do think that that's definitely something that we do need to do, but we also need to protect the reserves that we already have. And those are those ancient woodlands. So you can't protect something we don't know exists. So through projects like this, we can actually eliminate, well, if a site is ancient, how can we expand it in the way that's going to be most valuable to us as a resource and also to the environment? We don't want to put the wrong kind of species or microhabitats expanding from that. We want to make sure that it's as valuable as it can be, not just, for us, but for future generations and for the planet. So I thought that was really, really interesting, and it's definitely a study worth reading. I do believe it was posted originally by the BBC. It was at the end of 2022 as well, just in like the last sort of month of December that it was posted. So I just thought it was incredible how they were able to do that, so we don't have to keep chopping down woodlands. So we are in the midst of looking for volunteers for both archaeological and botanical surveys. We do have a really, really long email address for that. I don't know why it's that long. So you can just contact me on my normal work email if it's easier, rather than typing all that one out. But I've also added Know Your Place. So I know that you touched on that previously, but Know Your Place is something that was kind of made from the Wiltshire and Swindon History Centre and Bristol City Council. they digitize the tithe maps. So you can actually use Know Your Place to kind of obviously get to know your place, but view some of those digitized records, which I thought was really, really interesting. And I've also linked the handbook if anyone's interested. Oh, I've escaped. There was something for questions. Here is the page for questions. There we go. Thank you so much for listening. Ah, no. I am good with computers, I swear.
Thank you, Charlotte. Oh, well done, Andrew. You go now. Yeah, you carry on.
Yeah, no, we're always a team. Thank you, Charlotte. So let's go on to questions straight away. And if anyone wants a question, if you put the little hand up, that helps. If you don't and wave your just human hand, that helps too. Otherwise, just fire away. And I thought your pictures were wonderful. And good. There's a question from Bill Jarvis. Hannah as well. So in order, Bill, Hannah, anyone else, and me.
Okay, so few questions. How do you deal with all of this? How do you deal with single ancient trees? They're not in a woodland. The one in that parkland view showed presumably an ancient tree that is not in a woodland, so you can't count it. You're muted.
You are totally correct. I was muted. I was just talking to myself. I think I struggled to explain that quite clearly. Actually, that was my mistake, is that we are focused more on the habitats of the parkland itself rather than the individual trees, as the trees only make up like a certain part of the ancientness. We're mainly interested in the flora, what's underneath those trees growing around it, as that can show us whether that area is potentially or potentially not an ancient woodland. So that would be, there's quite a few ancient woodland indicator species. I think it does vary from place to place. So if we have like survey results from previous biological recording of a site that has recently said that they found, I don't know, 20 AWI species last summer, but we went back to visit the site this summer and only found 5, that does play a factor into it. But it's less about the individual trees themselves and more about the habitats. I hope no one would go back and chop it down.
Okay, so my question was how many trees make a viable woodland? What you're saying is it isn't the trees, it's the whole environment you're talking about, rather than just a tree or a number of trees. It's what goes with it. But then
I think it has to be about
if the trees are like 20 meters apart, is that still a woodland if it's got the right landscape in it?
There are quite a lot of umbrella terms that go underneath a woodland, or an ancient woodland or non-ancient woodland. But for this project specifically, we don't really want anything smaller than about 2 hectares. So even if the trees are quite dotted around the landscape, if it's over 2 hectares, it can be classified as a woodland, or at least worth investigating for the ancient woodland inventory. If it's less than that, it might not necessarily be relevant to this project or be classified as a woodland. It does. There are loopholes around them though. So it is on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you, Charlotte. I'm going to hustle you on. Interesting information. Thanks. Hannah, you've got a hand up.
Hi, Charlotte. You pretty much answered my question there. So in Shurston, we've got a woodland that's 1.8 hectares. I was just wondering what the minimum size to come and get surveyed was. But it does kind of link to not quite woodland, but kind of an area of scrub with some trees and stuff. So maybe it could just.
Yeah, I mean, you can always feel free to ping me an email, and then I'll go back and I'll have a look at the mapping over time, and I'll be able to see potentially whether or not it was ancient woodland before now, how long it's been woodland, was it recently, was it a plantation, was it not a plantation, and obviously if it has those qualities of ancientness, yeah, we'd love to come out and serve, that'd be great.
Yeah, because it's a community woodland, and it is getting coppice now, and
Okay.
it's pretty much all wood anemones,
Right.
and then loads and loads of dog mercury,
Yeah.
and bluebells, and it's lots of hazel. I think it's an old coppice, so
If it's
and
hazel,
some
probably
really
want
big
to
old
see it,
oaks.
yeah. Because hazel's one of the main species that we see a lot in ancient woodlands, or so far in my experience anyway. So that's definitely something that would be really interesting for us. Yeah.
And it's very it's on quite a steep slope, so I think it's just around here, like the fragments that are woodland, it's just where farmers haven't been able to get their machinery.
It's just been left over time. Yeah. We do see that quite a lot as well. Or areas of woodland that are sort of is in strips, not necessarily borders, but they're kind of in like small patches, because you can't get any machinery up there to use it for agricultural purposes, so they sometimes just been left and to grow over time, and they're the small fragments of woodland, which is lovely, but
Lovely,
very interesting.
thanks. Charlotte, I'm going to steer things slightly around to climate. We're interested in drawing down carbon, natural sequestration. Do you measure any soil organic carbon, or the amount or the depth or the percentage in any of the woodlands, or have access to any of that? And is it, I would assume that an ancient woodland would have reached an equilibrium. It's ancient, it's been pretty much the same for hundreds of years, hopefully, and we can't make new ancient woodland. So what can you tell us about the soil carbon content of ancient woodland?
That is a very good question. I personally I do know how to measure the carbon content of soils, but it isn't something that we do in this project, or it's not something that we're going to be doing throughout this survey season. It was something that I did talk about initially, because I did think it was a very, very important part to be able to measure one of those factors that equates to ancientness. But it's not something that's been prioritized at this time. Sorry, what was the other part of your question?
Oh, well, just how much carbon there is. And I was checking with you that it's presumably in equilibrium. So, because I think the point I want to make is we want to preserve ancient woodland, especially if both the vegetation and the soil below have a lot of carbon in them. You can't build up that much carbon with planting a new woodland, although you have to try and start. But preserving existing woodlands, especially mature ones, has got to be a way to protect the climate from, because if you chopped it down and burnt it, you'd be releasing that carbon if you ploughed it up and so on. Thank you. I'm trying to find out how to lower my hand. Bill, you got
okay, if you go into, how did I do it last time?
We're moving on to we've got
under reactions. Andrew, go to reaction. Yeah, sorry, I did put my hand up again because it sort of follows through on what you were talking about.
2 or 3 minutes before we move on. Thanks.
Yeah.
It's Nigel. Any chance for a quick word?
Sure. Oh, Bill.
Yeah, I'll drop back. Yeah, carry on.
Go ahead, Nigel.
Charlotte, very quickly.
Yeah.
Probably a rather peripheral question. But those of us who've been around long enough will remember when Wiltshire was characterised as much by its beech copses as it was by elms that stood on the top of many of the downs. And I'm just wondering whether, given the disaster of 3-4 generations ago with Dutch elm disease, and latterly ash dieback, and the slashing and burning that's going on by Wiltshire Council around on our main roads and so on, whether there's any evidence of any regrowth among the elms at all. I'm not talking about the introduction of disease-resistant varieties, but whether there's any evidence of old elms regenerating at all.
So that is a very good question. I haven't come into contact with too many elms yet, so it's not something that I can give much of an opinion on at this time. I'm hoping to see a few more. A lot of the woodlands I've visited so far are mainly being dominated by hazel or oak. But it would be really interesting to see if they were regenerating within the ancient woodlands themselves, or sort of more deep in the woodlands, or if they were expanding the elm outwards. That would be really, really interesting to see.
Thank you.
Okay, Bill, you got a quick one? It's coming up to 7.
Yeah, I think it was around the same sort of thing, that they're talking about ancient woodlands having already absorbed the carbon, because they have, and they're ancient. But actually, when you look at the picture we're looking at, trees there aren't ancient. So I presume it's, again, the whole environment, the whole landscape environment you're talking about, rather than just trees.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because a coppice woodland can be an ancient woodland, and of course that's heavily managed by humans. Charlotte, what's your response?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that totally. Ancient woodlands, even though they're ancient and they can be in a sense in an equilibrium, they do change over time, all the time, just like regular woodlands do, especially in the times that we're living in now. We're probably going to see the most change, in my opinion, in ancient woodlands round about now, because this is when the climate emergency is happening. So there could potentially be more uptake of carbon, there could be less. It remains to be seen. But there are quite a few different types of woodlands within ancient woodlands, and coppiced woodlands still count as ancient woodlands, even though they're managed. Because a lot of the woodlands, I'm saying woodlands a lot of the habitats that we work with are semi-natural. They're not necessarily pure, untouched ancient woodlands anymore, because at some point we've had settlers, we've had humans, we use it for building materials. There's been plantations, so parts of woodlands have been cut down for plantations, replanted, and so the outskirts is ancient, but the inner is just semi-natural. So a lot of what we work with isn't necessarily purely ancient woodlands anymore, even though they're still technically ancient woodlands, if that makes any sense. So I do think it's really interesting when you get to break down the different types of habitats that you're likely to find within the ancient woodlands themselves, and they all are slightly different. Because stour ahead here, in the picture that I've used in this background, it was previously categorized as completely ancient woodlands. The whole area was, and then when we went to go and investigate it a little bit further 40 years on, we found that actually, in our opinion, only some of it should be ancient, not all of it, because some of it was plantation, and some of it is invasive species, and some of it is gardens that aren't necessarily relevant, or orchards which aren't necessarily relevant. So it does change. They aren't stagnant, even if they are ancient, because even though we can't really see the change with the human eye over a couple of days, in the next 10-15 years, they're probably going to look quite a bit different.
Thank you very much indeed, Charlotte. It's come up to just past 7.
Yes.
I mean,
thank you so much.
You mentioned the word ancient a lot and the word woodland a lot.
I did, too many times.
I thought your photos were great. And one thing I like about this picture is that there's obviously public access, or which is extremely important for people to identify with these. And I'm also very impressed by the fact that it's a live project, and your data is growing and changing, and you're working with it and doing more and more with it. Thank you so much.
So much.
There are people who can't stay that long.